In this video, we're going to take a look at working with the info channels render kernel using Octane for Cinema 4D. And for this movie, I'm using the Limo 01 C4D scene, which has our characters here, space limousine, and a little spaceport in the background. So it's a fairly simple scene. I'm going to go to Octane settings, pull up the Octane settings, and let's go to the kernel tab, and I'm going to set this to info channels. So the info channels by default renders a wireframe of the scene. You can see that the type down here determines the type of info channel we're going to see. So info channels are great for diagnosing issues with the scene or rendering different passes that could be used in compositing. A lot of the different types of info channels rendering you'll see are also in the render passes section, so there's a little bit of overlap there. But we're just going to deal with the info channels render kernel at the moment, and we'll talk about render passes in another video. So if I set this to wireframe, you can see that here's a wireframe of all the objects in the scene. Our characters here are very dense, probably way too dense to be rigged and animated, but they're just here for demonstration purposes. But you can see their wireframe right here. If I set the type to geometric normals, we'll see shading based on the normal direction of the objects in the scene. You can see some visible faceting of the surfaces right here. If I set the type to shading normals, we get a very similar type of render, but this time the geometry is nice and smooth. So this is great for diagnosing if there are normal issues with the models in your scene. We also have position, which shades the objects in the scene based on their position in world space. So if I zoom out here, you can kind of get a sense for how that's shaded. This is a fairly flat scene, so there's not a whole lot of stuff sticking up in Y, but you can see in X and Z how they're shaded using kind of purples and blues. Let's take a look at Z depth. So I've set the Z depth max here to 76, just kind of a random number. By default, it's set to 5. In a large scene like this, everything is shaded white, since this is shading the objects based on their distance from the camera. So this is a very large scene, so 5 units isn't enough to capture the entire depth of the scene. So I'm going to raise that Z depth max. I'll set it to 500, and you can see now we have grayscale shading based on distance to camera. We also have material ID, so a different color is randomly assigned based on the materials assigned to the surfaces. We have texture coordinates, which gives us a color representation of the UV texture coordinates on the objects. Tangent, wireframe of course. Vertex normal, which is another type of normal shading based on the vertex direction. And object layer ID. This will give you a shading based on the objects in the scene, but also depending on the layer that has been assigned to them. So let's take a look at how that works. I'm going to select the limo group here and go to tags and choose C4D Octane tags, and I'll create an object tag, and I'll set this layer ID to 10. So I'm in the object layer section. If I set this to 10, then it's going to shade the different parts of the model based on this layer ID. So if I do the same thing for, let's say, the barbot here, I'll do tags, C4D and Octane tags, Octane object tag, select the object tag and object layer. I'll set this to 10. Sometimes it takes a little bit of nudging. There we go. Takes a couple of seconds, but now you can see. So colors have been randomly assigned to the different parts of the object here. And they're all sharing the same layer ID. If I go to ambient occlusion shading, we'll see the scene shaded based on ambient occlusion. And then of course we can change the AO distance. So if I lower this, then the shading gets much tighter. And as I raise it, the scene gets darker. We see more of the ambient occlusion shading. We have render layer ID. So in this case, it's kind of similar to what we were doing before with object layer ID, but instead of shading the different parts of the objects, everything that's on the same layer is getting the same color. So if I go to render layer ID again, and you can see that I have my barbot and my limo both have the same object layer. They're both on layer 10. So if I set this to 20 for the limousine, set it to 0. Sorry, 1, not 0. Okay, let's set it to 20. Now you can see everything on layer 20 gets that blue shading. Everything on layer 10 gets this green shading. So that is the render layer ID. Another way to do the render layer ID, if you want to pick a specific color for your render layers or your object layers, you can go down to object layer color. It'll render everything as black, but if I go into my object tag, here under object layer, you can see it says object color. So if I pick a color for this, like a bright green, or let's even do purple, now you can see all the objects that have that layer ID of 10 are going to be shaded bright pink, or whatever color you want to choose, which I think is very useful, or much more useful for compositing, because it's consistent and you can guarantee that it's always going to be the same color applied to that object when you're rendering for compositing, if you need to create a mask or something like that. You could also set this to pure white, and then you have a custom mask. So I think that's a great way to separate different objects into layers for rendering if you need to create a specific mask. We have light pass ID if your lights have a different ID assigned to them. So the lights on the robot, for instance, have their own light ID assigned to them, so they're showing up as red. We have tangent normals, opacity, everything in here is opaque, so we're basically seeing a white mask. Baking group ID, we'll talk more about this when we talk about baking lighting into scenes, but basically if I take my limo, for instance, I'll set its bake ID to 20. You can see that's also being shading. That's now being shaded based on its baking ID number. Down here we have some render, we have some info channels that are similar to render passes. So for example, if we want to render out just the roughness in the scene based on the roughness textures applied to the various objects, or the roughness setting. We also have index of refraction, diffuse filter, reflection filter, refraction filter. So many of these are doubled also as render passes. We'll talk about that when we get into render passes in a later video. So that's the basics of working with the info channel's render kernel.